In politics, does the content of a speech count as much as we usually think?
Saved a people from starvation and freed a country from brutal oppression.
What is the importance of non-verbal communication in the efficiency of a speech? Facial displays, gestures, intonation of the voice.
With courage and compassion, strength and resolve.
What are the emotional and rational elements which determine positive or negative reactions to a politician? Why are some politicians more charismatic than others?
I think charisma is a combination of being able to connect with the audience and having a sort of conversational relationship with the audience. This type of charisma is, I think, very well embodied by American leaders like Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, who I think resemble each other in that regard. But I think charisma is also comparable to what we call projection when we talk to the voice. Charisma means to have an effect not only on your immediate surroundings, but being able to have an effect sort of at a distance as well, to communicate in a way that impresses people.
Charisma is the capacity to attract attention so that people will look at an individual, combined with that magic of changing how they feel, and in the long run, how they think and act.
A charismatic person is someone that impresses you, that they're interesting, they're appealing, they have some degree of charm, and you trust their leadership.
Over the last 30 years, the development of ethology, psychology with the progress of images and sound technologies, have allowed us to better understand some of the elements of charisma in politics. Kings, princes, heads of states, and political leaders have always tried to appear powerful and self-confident. It is part of the image a leader wants to project, and it is, in a way, what people expect from a leader. However, political body language has evolved greatly throughout history. Just less than a century ago, when political leaders expressed themselves before thousands of people, they would stand on a rostrum, the crowd getting a glimpse of them from afar. Their postures and voice intonation were the predominant elements of non-verbal communication. Their body language was of a very theatrical, even caricature-like nature. The development of television has affected the body language of politicians and the way they communicate with the public. Television increased the power of images and propelled political leaders in close-up before audiences of millions of people. These days, behavior of politicians cannot escape the cameras with their facial expressions, gestures, and postures. The excessive exposure of political personalities turns them into veritable media stars. At the same time, information is treated practically in real time. It arrives faster, at a given point in time, and in fragmented form, making it even more important to convince and gain acceptance within a matter of minutes.
Sometimes People are convinced by ancient myths. Thus, in politics, nothing would matter but what is actually said. However, most voters know their politicians only through a TV screen, where the image is almighty. All of you will watch the same speeches of political leaders. Those of you in Group 1 will only have the images. You in Group 2 will have the images and the voice. And you will have the images and the filtered voice. So I'm going to ask you to choose just one emotion.
For many Americans, these 4 months have brought sorrow and pain.
To fight it together.
I've checked your answers, so the great majority of all groups has seen Ronald Reagan as a happy person. Jacques Chirac too. Funnily enough, Bush and even Blair appear to you as being worried, anxious or fearful. The conclusion is that most observers correctly recognize the emotions of a political leader just by referring to his face, and this in less than 2 seconds.
Recently, experiments using MRI have confirmed that our reaction to a picture of a political leader is determined mostly by the emotional part of our brain.
With our visual brain, we judge the faces of unknown politicians either positively or negatively. 1 second is just enough for us to vote for faces we find more competent or more attractive. As a matter of fact, such decision involves less our rational cortex than the limbic system, which is the center of our instinctive primary emotions. Supporters of a leader may react to his or her smiling face, just as in the case of love at first sight. In their brain, the areas activated are those of happiness, pleasure. Their eye pupils tend to dilate unconsciously. Opponents to the leader tend to contract their pupils, and the areas activated in their brain are those of anger or disgust.
Supposed to have said, wow, something sure has
Our
happened
emotional
here.
brain makes us react like primates observing another member of the group.
As it is today,
Is he dominant, assured, self-confident? Does he make us feel secure? Or is he
For many
anxious,
Americans,
fearful,
these 4 months have
insecure?
brought sorrow and pain that will never completely go
These
away.
primary roots of politics have been studied by Professor Roger Masters for more than 20 years.
The basic characteristic of our primate heritage is that we have these ways of displaying feelings and potential actions with cues that tell other people what we're feeling and what we might do. The human's facial display behavior is similar to that of non-human primates, and there are 3 main types: fear, anger, and happy reassurance. This is the fear display. You see the brows are down, the eyes are open, aware of things in the environment. The nose is breathing in air in case of need of flight, tight-lipped. If you look at the anger threat display, you see very, very different. You can see both upper and lower teeth. brows are really intense. The reassurance and happy display, very, very different. The raised eyebrows, the eyes are not staring, and there's the smile with both upper and lower teeth showing. Politics is part of human nature. Aristotle described humans as the political animal. Primates have, in general, the experience of leadership. There's some difference between the leader of the group and others in the group. And in humans, we have the same process.
Gestures and postures of leaders express dominance.
Change is a slogan I want to offer, change we can believe in.
Leadership is about the combination of cooperation and competition. This is true in primates. Among the great apes, the leader has to have the support of other members of the band. In politics, before you run for president, you've got to get the nomination of your party. So that clearly, the whole trick of combining competition with some people with cooperation and alliance with others is the name of the game.
Political campaign in humans, what is it? It is basically energizing your base to get them to support you and to win over others. But chimpanzees do the same thing. Normally the males are not very interested in babies. And so in the same way that human politicians hold their babies and kiss them all the time during campaigns, chimpanzee males will do the same thing in order to become popular. And if they're very popular, they are more successful at challenging somebody else.
Dear Governor Bush, thank you for coming to our school and for your visit.
That love can outlast hate, that the light of human life can shine on through the most terrible darkness.
Our repertoire of facial displays is much richer than that of apes. Our emotions are more complex, and we have more facial muscles than our cousins, which allows us to express blended emotions and a wider range of displays. Professor Niku Seb has developed a computerized program allowing us to analyze the proportions of various emotions expressed on a face.
Our system is based on an appearance-based model. So this means that we have a mask which is fitting on the face, and this one will trace the movement of the facial muscles so that it will just reflect the actual facial expressions. So when we construct the mask, we use a simplified model of the muscle of the face. So what we have in there, we have pairs of 12 muscles, and these one are used to capture the most predominant movement of the face, like movement of the mouth, cheeks, eyebrows, and the upper part of the face. Blair in this picture is showing a very, very clear expression of happiness. So he is extremely expressive, and he shows all the characteristics of this emotion. So the mouth wide open, the eyes a little bit closer, and he is very convincing.
Now, how about Nicolas Sarkozy?
Well, I mean, he is certainly gesticulating a lot. And I think his face is less charismatic than others. And he has a very strange combination of different emotions.
Oh, yes. We can see here a sadness, for example.
So he's not that expressive, even though he's trying to emphasize this one by moving his hands.
Yes, but especially he's less authoritative than people believe, because people believe he has a very strong authority. Now, you can't have a strong authority if you're sad or if you're fearful.
Right. George Bush is a very good example of the way he's combining contradictory facial expressions. So you can see traces of happiness, like 11%, but on the other hand, he's also angry and disgust. And I think this is very characteristic of him. So in some sense, showing some very positive part, and on the other hand, he's very determined and a little bit, sad and worried about the subject. So in this sequence depicting Ronald Reagan, you can see that he is very, very good actor. He can show good combination of emotions, so happiness, so he has a good smile, and then some determination, which is given by the angry and the disgust. In most of the cases, indeed, we, as human beings, we have different facial expressions when showing a neutral expression. So the idea is that, indeed, some of the people will have a sad face or a more smiley face. A good example of a politician who has a natural sad, neutral face will be George Bush. And another example would be, for example, Tony Blair would be a more happy face. What we notice is that, in general, we have blended emotions. That's true. However, in some cases, like when a person is showing happiness or surprise, you can see very high percentage of these emotions. And from our experience, it seems that the positive emotions tend to be more absolute, and the negative emotions tend to be more blended.
Para esta tierra esté en la Junta de Andalucía.
Charismatic facial displays are clear signs of authority, dominance, or signs of happiness and joy, but never signs of anxiety or sadness. It is also necessary that facial displays are consistent with body postures and gestures, another very important element of charisma.
Imagine politicians that don't gesture, that have their hands and arms rigidly by their bodies. You would find that very strange. You would find them not only stiff, but also uncommunicative. Most of the gestures that you see politicians make serve two main purposes. One is simply to emphasize a point.
Still a force for freedom and peace and democracy at home and around the world. I am convinced more than ever in my life that the best days of this country are still ahead of us.
The other aspect is that with the change in the hand shape or in the motion pattern, units of speech are marked off.
To work through the details of it and make sure
A new unit of speech begins with a new hand shape or a new motion pattern. So in effect, the viewer knows how to structure what he or she is hearing from watching the gestural motions.
And we've got the chance over
But there are also a number of more specific gestures, or gestures that have more specific meanings. To this day, politicians are very fond of making the gesture of the precision grip, which was already described in ancient Rome in politicians during that time. It suggests that what's being said right now is something very specific, right? You pick out a specific object that you're talking about, or you say something very specific about that object. A very common kind of gesture that you find among politicians simply uses kind of chopping motion, a kind of slicing motion, which is then made with a variety of different hand shapes. The precision grip, an extended pointing index finger, a flat hand, which kind of emphasizes the slicing motion, and so on.
It's a critical national security issue for our future, and politics must stop at the schoolhouse door.
It's important that you look at the context in which the gesture is made and not believe that there is a fixed meaning to the particular gesture.
En sentimiento, y por tanto se puede hablar de solidaridad.
You do sometimes find politicians making iconic gestures, as, for example, George W. Bush putting his hands as if he is strangulating something while he says the grip of terror.
Slowly but surely, the grip of terror around the throats of the Iraqi people is being loosened.
Another way of thinking about this gesture is to think about it as a metaphor, because the word grip of terror, of course, is a metaphor, and so the gesture emphasizes that metaphorical quality of his talk. Among radical, populist political leaders, you often find a body language that kind of runs against the established norms. So by performing in an outrageous kind of manner, they seek to appeal to the masses that are fed up with the established political system. A good example of that is Mussolini, who in this segment not only uses sort of a very theatrical body motion, but also explains his concepts by gesture in a way that is very uncommon among established politicians. A part of bodily behavior that we don't usually think much about is how people walk. And it seems that in ancient Rome, there was a class of politicians gaining an influence during the Republic, and they came from the provinces, from the country. And they had a very different style of moving than the urban elite of Rome. And so they embodied their politics by walking in what used to be called a rustic kind of way. Tendency to moderate gesture has a lot to do with the way the human body is seen in Western culture. Christianity plays a part in that. And so, for example, during the Middle Ages, when somebody gestured exuberantly, that was seen as a sign that the person was unable to control his or her bodily urges. To this day, the proscription against all too expressive gestures is motivated by the idea that there is a lack of self-control in the speaker. Whereas, as a communication scholar, I would say the more you gesture and the more complex your gestures are, the more you actually communicate with your audience. I think we're experiencing a real renaissance of gesture, and I think that this may have something to do with the visual nature of today's society.
Give me a break. This whole thing is the biggest fairy tale I've ever seen.
While the emotions, intent, and expressiveness of our political leaders can be recognized in their facial expressions and body language, their ability to convince us is also highly dependent on voice quality and intonation.
Down the tensions that have risen there.
To believe that together, with God's help, we can and will resolve the problems which now confront us. And after all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans.
The voice is linked to the way in which we communicate with each other and the world, which is not only a scientific, but also a psychological point of view. The voice is linked to the speaker's intent, and the speaker's intent can be heard by listening to the tone of voice.
Freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. I have a dream today. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
Because in the end, the voice represents the balance between the outside and the inside, between our thoughts and the expression of those thoughts. There are several different voice types. Firstly, the head voices, which are characterized by a direction, especially the direction of the face. Head voices make one appear important, often trying to be convincing. We then have one voice similar to the head voice, the oral voice, that puts into play the buccal cavity. For example, Tony Blair has a voice in which the mouth is active, giving the voice a sharp quality, the voice putting out treble harmonics with a forceful effect.
We have to fight. Britain has learnt that lesson many times before in our history.
Another example of oral voice is that of Bill Clinton, who doesn't really have a deep resonating voice or chest voice. His voice is rather high-pitched, so it can be considered an oral voice with a relatively nasal quality.
Our adversaries can become our allies. At the special NATO summit this summer, that is what we will begin to do. We must strengthen NATO's partnership for peace with non-member allies.
We also have voices that emanate from the larynx, called throat voices. These voices are voices that are tight in the throat. They indicate a search for words, where the word takes precedence over resonance. And so these voices are always less charismatic than resonating voices.
We should do that very carefully because
Voices that can make us feel especially ill at ease are those which use the throat in particular and emanate predominantly from the head. The voice is not using the body as a whole and is disturbing because it's throaty and stuck in the throat, as for former German Foreign Minister, Mr. Fischer.
You have to make the case. And to make a case in the democracy, you must convince by yourself. Excuse me, I'm not convinced.
You promise a meeting at that high a level before you know what the intentions are. I don't want to be used for propaganda purposes.
Hillary Clinton is someone whose voice is falsely self-assured. Her voice reveals a certain fragility, and its register is more from the larynx and head.
Smithsonian in front of the most valuable icon in our history.
You couldn't say that Hillary Clinton has a chest voice that is seductive or affirmative, as for Margaret Thatcher.
Together our nations have faced the challenges of our time and have not flinched. We forged ahead with strengthening the peace, spreading prosperity, and safeguarding liberty.
Hillary Clinton plays on the emotional register for the very reason that the lack of assurance in her voice allows this emotional fragility to be heard without any attempt to disguise it.
Step on a long journey throughout the country as we put our cases forward.
The stomach voices are the most valued voices because they provide a solid bass and abundant treble harmonics. It's a voice you find in particular in Ronald Reagan, who had a good balance between bass and treble.
Take the oath I've just taken.
He not only had a very sustaining voice, but a stomach voice that brought everything into play and gave him a balanced voice which was extremely harmonious.
The exemplar of freedom and a beacon of hope for those who do not now have freedom. To those neighbors and allies who share our freedom, we will strengthen our historic ties and assure them of our support and firm commitment. We will match loyalty with loyalty. We will strive.
Another important element of the efficiency of vocal messages is the number of words per minute.
Money cannot buy it. Power cannot compel it. Technology cannot create it. It can only come from the human spirit.
Even if there are cultural differences between languages, tests have been done showing that usually the right pace is between 140 and 180 words per minute. Under 140, the attention of the audience is decreasing and a feeling of boredom develops. Over 180, the flow of words is too big and the message becomes unclear.
The United States respects rule of law. But in a debate on migration...
Pauses in a speech are also very important, although there are sometimes pauses marking hesitation and uncertainty.
Or how we used our intelligence to, for example...
But most of the time, pauses are there to mark authority, emphasis, or solemnity.
Friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger.
I think usually you find a lot of coherence or consistency in the different communicative media that we use in everyday communication, meaning gaze, gesture, body posture, and speech. They go together actually in very subtle, very intricate ways. But every so often you find that there's a discrepancy between somebody's, let's say, facial expression and the content of what the person is saying. I think the American President Bush is an example of that. You often find him showing a facial expression that does not seem to congruent with the content of his speech. One thing that is striking about the facial expression of George W. Bush is its asymmetry, and you can see that asymmetry especially clearly in his eyebrows. When he uses his eyebrows, he raises his eyebrows to convey emphasis. They often end up in different positions, one being higher than the other, and that makes his face look as if he finds what he's saying funny. People have a very difficult time interpreting that.
Well, but what wasn't wrong was the fact that he had the ability to make a weapon.
So the asymmetry of Bush's face is also visible in the mouth. His mouth is diagonal and his face is longer on one side and shorter on the other. It is crooked, as we say.
This is all in the context of war.
Coherence usually comes naturally, but when there is a lack of coherence, somebody needs help.
Growing up, she gave me love and lots of advice. I gave her white hair.
The public can, of course, sense at its emotional levels whether they are seeing a strong, self-confident behavior or a behavior which is, to some degree, acting strong without really having that inner strength just subconsciously.
Political charisma and the impact of a leader depend heavily on the historical, cultural, and social context of a country.
There's one kind of charisma which occurs when a society is under threat and a charismatic leader shows strength. He shows he's not afraid of this threat, and he can bring his entire society, if they follow him, to have enough self-confidence to overcome that threat. Now, in Hitler's case, that involved showing a tremendous amount of aggression in his nonverbal behavior. If you look at a speech of Hitler's, at the beginning, when he mounts on the podium, you can see some signs of insecurity. What he was extremely clever about doing was to creating a great deal of energy. He spoke with great force. And then he had this trick of having trained his followers to have those shared emotions, like he would say something and instead of applause, the audience would all go Heil Hitler at the same time. Well, this gave this image of enormous power because he was speaking with terrific energy and focus and triggering these wild responses of huge crowds And that was what was being presented in the media, remembering that the media in Hitler's time were movies. And the camera would be placed in a certain place, which would make him look good, and then the resulting film would be edited in a way to remove any sign of weakness. That is, we have a very different world in TV because TV catches what's there.
Even though the political education of the public has developed over the past few decades, all the political imagery transmitted by television and modern media tends to lead people to operate on the principle of contrasting behaviors. The brain instinctively produces a visual comparison of the different political leaders. Certain images are subconsciously memorized. Politicians getting out of cars, smiling, shaking hands, but also expressions of nervousness, sadness, or stress. By quantifying the proportion of positive and negative expressions and postures, the public's brain spontaneously produces a comparative description in terms of authority, self-confidence, and affinity. The key to popularity is quite often found in the combination of three elements: authority, energy, and happiness.
While there are differences between societies and cultures in what voters expect from their politicians and what kind of public performance they expect from their politicians, cultures, of course, also change over time, and expectations change, and they may change very rapidly.
You forecast two things. First, that the decade would be less dangerous if the West maintained the
changes in the expectations of the public usually reflect changes in the society. And one of the major changes in many countries during the last few decades has been the growing role of women and the access of women to leading positions.
I'm thrilled to have everyone here on this stage who represents the past, the present, and the future of our country.
Research has shown that women are more expressive than men, both in their spontaneity and interactivity, particularly with smiling and laughter, which can be their political weapons.
I think women tend to be more low-key in their public performances and not as, they don't make the same kinds of attempts to project power in their gestures and through their body language.
On mountaintops and in caves, you will not escape the justice of this nation.
Men's postures, gestures, and body communication are much more based on the primary patterns of the dominant male, whereas women play much more on a participative, exchange register and are more expressive and receptive.
In general, you can notice some statistical difference between men and women, in the sense that women tend to be more happy, more enthusiastic, and men seems to be more pragmatic, in the sense that they show traces of anger or disgust. However, there are different women which are so-called strong women, which tend to show a lot of emotions that are characteristic to men.
Mr. President, when you welcomed me to the White House,
alors, lorsque l'État central, en fonctionnant mieux et en étant au clair,
political combat and the predominance of men in politics forces women to adopt the male style, displaying authority and sometimes aggressiveness, so as to appear at least as credible and competent as their male counterparts.
solidaire, voilà l'enjeu de l'année prochaine.
The real challenge for a woman in politics is to find the right balance between displays of happiness, empathy, receptivity, which are more natural for women, and more offensive displays of authority, which are more natural for men. Hillary Clinton achieves this balance quite successfully. Smiles and happiness contribute greatly to popularity, both for men and women. Seduction is part of charisma, and smiling is a major weapon in seduction. But what about the smiles of our political leaders?
Most of the smiles we make, unless we're having a great time, are not the true smiles of enjoyment. They're social smiles, they're agreement smiles, sometimes false smiles. The difference is a very subtle difference. It's not in the lips, not in the cheeks. It's in what's called the eye cover fold, this little patch of skin between your eyebrow and your upper eyelid, which slightly moves down if it's an enjoyment smile, but very subtle, not easy to recognize.
In politics, all is a matter of balance between natural behavior and controlled attitudes. Even if rehearsed, the more natural it looks, the more efficient it will be. It is important for politicians to have an accurate representation of their image, to be able to play on the right register depending on situations.
We've made tremendous progress from the past, and the treaty is setting...
So in these conditions, can we expect our politicians to be spontaneous or to be sincere?
You know, I'm not going to comment on that.
I don't think it is likely that you're going to be elected to a high office unless you're quite a good performer, public performer. So yes, they do have the skills to be able to mislead us when they choose to do so, and we probably all know that when we elect them. Now in this country, in the United States, people say the characteristic they value most in a politician is honesty. On the other hand, everyone's very cynical about whether politicians ever really tell us the truth.
And we'll find out about the weapons of mass destruction that we all thought were there. That's part of the Iraqi survey group and the group I've put together to look at.
My research shows very clearly that most people cannot tell when someone is lying to them from demeanor, from their face, body, voice, and speech. Less than 5% who are at all accurate from demeanor.
Well, but what wasn't wrong was the fact that he had the ability to make a weapon.
Although there is no Pinocchio's nose, there are signs of an emotion that doesn't fit what we're saying, or that we're thinking more than we would be expected to think.
How do you respond to critics who say that you brought the nation to war under false pretenses?
Yes. First of all, I expected to find the weapons.
There are these signs, whenever we call them hotspots, and when you see them, they suggest, here's a place where you're not getting the full story, find out why.
Now, I have to go back to work on my State of the Union speech, and I worked on it till pretty late last night. But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you.
Where you see signs of a lie can vary from one person to another. For him, it's in the use of distancing language, where he puts the person at a distance from himself. So it's, I never had sexual relations with that woman.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
It would have been more convincing if he said, I never had sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky, rather than putting the distance. So that is really the main suggestion that he's not telling the truth. But we see before that, before he says a word, he sucks in and bites his lower lip. which is a mannerism that's not uncommon for him, but is a mannerism that you see in children who are about to tell you an untruth. I try to distinguish between truthfulness and lying, and then there's a fuzzy area in between. Now, in a lie, I'm deliberately trying to mislead you, and I've given you no reason to think that that's what I'm going to do. So an actor can't lie, because you know that an actor is not going to be telling you the truth. They're playing a role. But if they're a good actor, then you are gripped by it and you believe it. So is the actor lying? No, he's not lying, because you're notified. In some sense, we don't expect politicians to tell us all the truth. Certainly not in public, where it could be used by their domestic enemies and their international enemies.
I know you are worried. First of all, if we are communists. And of course, I have said very clear that we are not communists. Very clear.
So, can politicians lie? In my definition, no, but they can deceive us, and we expect them to deceive us. Now, in a democracy, that's a real problem, because if an electorate is not informed, how is it going to make a choice? And yet, if everything that the politician says to us is heard by his opponents and by his enemies internationally, he can't tell us all the truth. So it's a dilemma for which I don't have a solution.